The cypress shed behind the sugar house had to be rebuilt 3 times because no carpenter in St. James Parish could frame a doorway tall enough for Josiah to stand upright. By 1827, overseers stopped trying. They let him sleep curled on his side like a child, knees drawn to his chest, one massive hand tucked beneath his head. Visitors to the Bellefontaine plantation often asked to see the giant, and the master obliged, charging $1 for the privilege of watching Josiah haul a loaded cane cart that would ordinarily require 2 mules. What those visitors never saw was the way Josiah's eyes tracked the bayou channels during his rare trips to the levee, or the cache of dried fish and cornmeal hidden in a hollow cypress 3 miles into the marsh, or the rope he'd been weaving from Spanish moss for 2 years, strand by strand, long enough to cross the widest channel when the moment came. The Louisiana sugar country in the 1820s smelled like burnt molasses and river mud. The air was thick enough to chew, especially during grinding season when the cane mills ran day and night and smoke from the boiling houses stained the sky the color of old brass. Bellefontaine Plantation sat on 1,600 acres of alluvial soil along the west bank of the Mississippi, 7 miles south of the settlement that would later become Convent. The main house was a 2-story structure built in the French colonial style, cypress timber and whitewashed brick, with galleries on both floors to catch whatever breeze moved across the cane fields. Behind it stood the sugar mill, the boiling house, the cooperage, and a cluster of cabins where 93 enslaved people lived in conditions that made the master's hunting dogs look pampered by comparison. Josiah was born on the plantation in 1809, the son of a woman named Miriam who worked in the main house kitchen until yellow fever took her in 1814. His father's identity was never recorded, though some of the older workers whispered that he'd been a Choctaw man who'd passed through selling pelts and had stayed long enough to father 2 children before disappearing back into the swamps. What mattered more than parentage was that Josiah grew, and kept growing until the overseers realized they had something unprecedented on their hands. By age 12, Josiah stood 6 feet 4 inches. By 15, he'd reached 7 feet. At 18, he measured 8 feet and 1 inch in his bare feet, with shoulders so broad he had to turn sideways to fit through most doorways. His hands could palm a man's head like an orange. His voice was surprisingly soft, a low rumble that carried without shouting, and he moved with a peculiar grace for someone his size, as if he were constantly aware of the space his body occupied and the damage it could do if he wasn't careful. The master, a man named Claude Bellefontaine, saw opportunity. He'd inherited the plantation from his father in 1823 and was determined to make it the most profitable operation in the parish. Sugar was brutal work, harder than cotton, harder than rice, harder than anything except perhaps mining, and it killed workers with reliable efficiency. Yellow fever, accidents with the grinding rollers, infected wounds, exhaustion, and simple despair whittled down the enslaved population faster than births could replace it. Purchasing new workers was expensive. But a man who could do the work of 3, that was an investment worth showcasing. Bellefontaine had a special harness made for Josiah, thick leather straps that crossed his chest and connected to iron rings welded onto a reinforced cane cart. When the plantation's mules died or fell lame, Josiah was hitched in their place. Visitors who came to tour the operation would gather near the fields to watch this human draft animal haul loads that should have been impossible. Bellefontaine charged admission. $1 to see the giant work, $2 if you wanted to stand close enough to hear the leather creak as Josiah leaned into the traces. The overseer, a Kentuckian named Virgil Cass, loved to tell a story about the time Josiah had pulled a wagon out of mud so deep It had trapped both wheels to the axle. 4 men with ropes and poles had failed to budge it. Josiah had simply walked to the front, braced his legs, and lifted the entire wagon, contents included, while 2 workers shoved planks beneath the wheels. The story lost nothing in repeated tellings, and Cass embellished it freely, claiming the wagon had weighed 2,000 pounds, then 3,000, then more. What Cass never mentioned was that after performing this feat, Josiah had been given no extra rations, no rest, and no acknowledgement beyond being sent immediately to the next task. But Josiah noticed things. He noticed that the bayou channels shifted with the seasons, that some paths through the cypress swamps stayed dry even when the river rose, that the Spanish moss growing on the north sides of trees was denser and could be woven into cordage stronger than hemp if you knew the technique. He noticed that the white men who came to gawk at him never ventured more than 100 yards from the cleared plantation grounds, as if the wilderness beyond was a wall they couldn't imagine crossing. He noticed that fear could be useful, that his size made people uncomfortable in ways that sometimes worked to his advantage. A man who looked like he could snap another man in half. With his hands was a man who had to be watched, but also a man who might be left alone when surveillance grew tiresome. He had a younger sister named Ruth, born in 1817. She was small, barely 5 feet tall, with their mother's quick hands and sharp mind. She worked in the weaving house, making the rough cloth used for work clothes and grain sacks. Josiah loved her the way a mountain loves its shadow, silently, absolutely, with a protectiveness that needed no words. In October of 1827, Ruth made a mistake. She looked up. The incident happened on a Saturday afternoon when the grinding season was in full swing and exhaustion had worn everyone's patience to a thread. Ruth had been sent to the main house to deliver finished cloth, and on her way back to the weaving house, she'd passed the master's son, a 19-year-old named Etienne, who'd recently returned from a year of schooling in New Orleans. Etienne had been drinking since noon. This was evident from his unsteady gait and the way his words slurred together. And when Ruth stepped aside to let him pass, he'd grabbed her arm. What Etienne intended would never be entirely clear, because Ruth had jerked away reflexively, and in doing so, she'd met his eyes. For 3 seconds, maybe 4, she'd looked directly at him without the downcast gaze that was required, expected, enforced. It was reflex, not defiance. But it didn't matter. Etienne struck her across the face hard enough to split her lip. Then he called for Cass. The overseer came running, and within minutes Ruth was dragged to the yard between the cabins where punishments were administered publicly to ensure everyone understood the cost of transgression. Cass used a braided leather whip, 3 feet long with a weighted tip that could open skin to the bone. Standard punishment for insolence was 10 lashes. Etienne, still drunk and humiliated by his own overreaction, demanded 20. Josiah was in the cane fields when he heard the commotion. He was a quarter-mile away, hauling a cart loaded with freshly cut cane, but the sound carried across the flat land. The crack of leather, the gasps from the assembled workers, Ruth's involuntary cries that she tried so hard to suppress. He dropped the cart traces and ran. By the time he reached the yard, Cass had delivered 14 lashes. Ruth was on her knees, her back a canvas of blood and torn flesh. She was conscious, but shaking, her hands pressed flat against the ground, as if she could anchor herself to the earth and endure. Josiah walked through the crowd, and people stepped aside without being asked. He was twice as tall as most of them, and when he moved with purpose, it was like watching a building uproot itself and stride forward. Cass saw him coming, and raised the whip reflexively, a warning gesture. But Josiah didn't slow. "That's enough," Josiah said. His voice was quiet, but it stopped the overseer mid-motion. Cass recovered quickly. He was a practical man who understood that control was a performance, and any crack in that performance would spread like rot through timber. "You don't give orders here, boy. Get back to your work, or you'll take the rest of her lashes yourself." Josiah looked at Ruth. She was trying to turn her head to see him, but the pain made movement difficult. Blood ran down her back in rivulets, soaking into the dirt beneath her knees. 14 lashes, 6 more to go. "I'll take them," Josiah said. The crowd went silent. Even Etienne, still swaying near the edge of the yard, seemed to sober slightly. Cass hesitated. Whipping Josiah was complicated. The man was too valuable to risk permanent injury, and Bellefontaine had made it clear that Josiah was not to be damaged in ways that would reduce his capacity to work. But backing down in front of 93 witnesses would undermine every ounce of authority Cass possessed. "Fine," Cass said. "You take 6, and your sister gets another 4 for making me waste time arguing. That's the cost of your mouth." Mathematics of cruelty. Josiah took the whipping without making a sound. Cass put his full weight into each strike, trying to provoke some reaction, some sign of pain or submission that would restore the proper order of things. But Josiah simply stood there, his massive frame absorbing blows that should have driven a normal man to his knees. When it was finished, his back looked like fresh plowed earth, but he walked to Ruth, lifted her as gently as if she were made of glass, and carried her to their cabin while the crowd dispersed in silence. That night, lying on her stomach while Josiah cleaned her wounds with water and the stub of soap they'd saved for emergencies, Ruth whispered, "You shouldn't have done that." "I know. They'll make it worse now." "I know." "Josiah." "I know." But what Josiah knew, what had crystallized in his mind the moment he'd seen his sister's blood soaking into Louisiana dirt, was that this place would eventually kill them both. Not today, not this month, but inevitably. The mathematics were simple. You could only endure so many lashes, so many 18-hour days, so many illnesses without medicine, so many years of being treated as equipment that happened to breathe. The system was designed to extract maximum value before disposal. Survival required escape, and escape required preparation. The Louisiana wetlands in the 1820s were a maze of cypress swamps, bayou channels, oxbow lakes, and sandbars that appeared and vanished with the river's moods. The terrain was hostile to anyone who didn't know its rhythms. Alligators longer than canoes sunned themselves on mudbanks. Water moccasins hung from low branches like diseased fruit. The thick canopy of cypress and tupelo blocked out the sun, turning daylight into permanent twilight. A person could walk in circles for days and die within shouting distance of dry ground. But Josiah had been studying the swamps for years. Every time he was sent to haul timber from the cypress groves, he'd memorized landmarks. The lightning-struck oak with the split trunk that pointed due north. The sandbar shaped like a bent elbow that marked the deepest channel. The grove of tupelo where the water never rose above ankle depth, even during floods. He'd learned which plants were edible, which would make you sick, which could be used to treat wounds or fevers. He'd learned that the best crossing points were often the most dangerous looking, because white men assumed danger where there was none, and safety where death waited. He began preparing in earnest after Ruth's whipping. The cache in the hollow cypress grew slowly. Dried fish smoked over fires built deep in the swamp, where no one from the plantation would venture. cornmeal stolen a handful at a time from the mill storage, a tin cup that had been discarded near the cooperage. He wove rope from Spanish moss, working in darkness after the day's labor was finished, his huge fingers moving with surprising delicacy to braid the fibers into cordage. By early December of 1827, he had nearly 200 feet of rope coiled and hidden. But rope and supplies meant nothing without people. Josiah understood that a single escapee might evade capture through speed and luck. A group of 20 or 30 would be slower, louder, easier to track. The mathematics were grim. Take too few, and you abandoned people to face collective punishment for your escape. Take too many, and you ensured everyone's recapture. He began to talk quietly with people he trusted, not about escape, never that directly, but about the swamps, about roots, about theoretical possibilities. He spoke with Thomas, a man in his 40s who'd worked the sugar mill for 20 years and had lost 2 fingers to the grinding rollers. Thomas knew machinery, knew how to disable the mill's drive chain so it would take days to repair. He spoke with Sarah, a woman who worked in the plantation kitchen and had access to the main house at odd hours. She knew which rooms were occupied when, which doors were locked, where the master kept his firearms. He spoke with Ruth, who was quiet for 3 days after the whipping, and then came to him with a calmness that frightened him more than tears would have. "When you go," she said, "I'm coming. Your back isn't healed. I don't care. Ruth, don't tell me to wait. Don't tell me it's too dangerous. I've already decided." Josiah looked at his sister, this small woman whose shoulders barely reached his waist, and saw their mother's stubbornness staring back at him. There would be no arguing with her, no protecting her from herself. She would come, or she would die trying, and those were the only 2 options the world offered. "All right," he said, "but we do it my way. We prepare. We don't rush. How long? As long as it takes to do it right." What neither of them knew was that time was running out faster than either could have anticipated. Because on December 8th, 1827, a cotton merchant from Baton Rouge arrived at Bellefontaine Plantation with an offer that Claude Bellefontaine found impossible to refuse. $3,000 for Josiah, who would be transported to a traveling exhibition that displayed human curiosities throughout the eastern states. The sale was scheduled for December 20th. Josiah had 12 days. The cotton merchant's name was Samuel Hendricks, and he arrived at Bellefontaine on a Wednesday afternoon in a hired carriage driven by a free man of color who kept his eyes carefully forward and his mouth carefully shut. Hendricks was a rotund man in his 50s, with mutton chop whiskers and a suit that cost more than most enslaved people would earn in a lifetime if they'd been paid for their labor. He carried himself with the easy confidence of someone who'd spent decades turning human suffering into profit margins and saw nothing wrong with the arithmetic. Claude Bellefontaine received him in the plantation's main parlor, a room decorated with furniture shipped from France and portraits of ancestors who'd grown rich on sugar and silence. They drank brandy from crystal glasses while discussing the weather, the cotton market, the political situation in Washington. Then Hendricks got to business. "I've heard you have a curiosity on your property," Hendricks said, "a man of unusual stature." Bellefontaine smiled. He'd been expecting this. Word of Josiah had spread beyond St. James Parish, carried by visitors who'd paid their dollar and told the story to anyone who'd listen. "I do. 8 feet tall, strong as an ox. I've had offers before." "I'm sure you have, but I'm not offering to buy him for labor. I'm offering to buy him for exhibition." Bellefontaine raised an eyebrow. "Exhibition? There's a gentleman in Philadelphia who operates a museum of natural wonders. He displays botanical specimens, geological formations, and human anomalies. He's particularly interested in giants, and from what I've heard, your Josiah would be the centerpiece of his collection. You want to put him on permanent display. Precisely. He'd be well fed, kept in good health. His value increases with proper maintenance. And you'd receive $3,000 cash, plus a percentage of exhibition revenues for the first year. $3,000 was more than Bellefontaine cleared in profit during a good harvest. It was enough to purchase 6 prime field hands, repair the mill's aging machinery, and still have money left over. The temptation was immediate and overwhelming, but Bellefontaine was also a cautious man. What about the disruption to my workforce? Josiah does the work of 3 men. I'd need to replace that labor. The $3,000 would cover purchasing replacements twice over, Hendricks said smoothly. And think of the prestige. You'd be known as the man who raised the Louisiana giant. That's worth more than mere labor. Prestige was currency that Bellefontaine understood. He'd spent 20 years trying to establish himself as more than just another sugar planter. He wanted to be remembered, to be discussed in New Orleans parlors and Washington drawing rooms. Josiah's fame could become his fame. When would you need him? I'd like to take him by December 20th. That gives me time to arrange transport and arrive in Philadelphia before the new year. Bellefontaine agreed that night. The contract was drawn up the next morning. Josiah would be sold for $3,000, with Bellefontaine receiving an additional 5% of gross exhibition revenues for 12 months. The sale would be finalized on December 20th, with Hendricks taking possession immediately. Word spread through the plantation before Bellefontaine had even finished signing the papers. The enslaved community had networks of information that moved faster than any official announcement. By afternoon, Josiah knew he was being sold. By evening, he knew the date. 12 days had become 11. There was a man who could have stopped everything before it began, and his silence deserves its own terrible accounting. Father Mathieu Robichaud had served as the parish priest for 17 years, ministering to the white families who owned the sugar plantations, and occasionally, when schedules permitted, offering abbreviated services to the enslaved populations. He was 62 years old, educated at a seminary in Mobile, and generally regarded as a kind man who kept his sermons short and his judgments private. He'd baptized Etienne Bellefontaine as an infant, presided over Claude Bellefontaine's marriage, and said last rites over the master's father when yellow fever took him in 1821. Father Robichaud visited Bellefontaine Plantation every other Sunday to hold Mass in the main house's parlor. On December 9th, 1827, he arrived for his usual visit and was invited to stay for dinner. During the meal, Claude Bellefontaine mentioned the sale of Josiah to Samuel Hendricks, describing it as a fortunate business opportunity that would benefit everyone involved. The museum in Philadelphia is quite reputable, Bellefontaine said, carving slices from a roasted duck that had been prepared by an enslaved woman named Hannah. Josiah will be treated well, better than field work, certainly. Father Robichaud set down his fork. You're selling him to be put on display? Like an animal? Like a natural wonder. There's a difference. Is there? The temperature in the room dropped several degrees. Bellefontaine's wife, Marie, looked between the two men with the practiced anxiety of someone who'd spent years preventing social disasters. Etienne, still nursing a grudge about the Ruth incident, watched with barely concealed interest. Father, Bellefontaine said carefully, I respect your spiritual guidance, but surely you understand that managing a plantation requires practical decisions. Josiah is my property, legally purchased and registered. What I choose to do with him is my right. Legal rights and moral rights are not always the same thing. Are you suggesting I've acted immorally? Father Robichaud could have said yes. He could have cited scripture, invoked the dignity of man created in God's image, refused to offer Mass at Bellefontaine again until the sale was canceled. He could have made it a scandal, could have preached about it to the parish's wealthiest families, could have created social pressure that might have changed Claude Bellefontaine's calculations. Instead, he looked at his plate, at the roasted duck and the imported wine and the crystal that caught the candlelight, and he made a choice that men like him had been making for centuries. I'm suggesting, Father Robichaud said quietly, that you consider whether the monetary gain is worth the spiritual cost. But the decision is yours, of course. Of course, Bellefontaine said, and the conversation moved on. Father Robichaud finished his meal. He drank the wine. He thanked Marie for her hospitality. He left with a promise to return in 2 weeks for his next visit. And he never spoke to Josiah, never asked the man what he wanted, never considered that silence was its own form of violence. What would you do if you had the power to stop something monstrous and chose comfort instead? The question isn't hypothetical. People make that choice every day, in small ways and large, trading justice for convenience, trading others' suffering for their own peace. Father Robichaud would live another 14 years. He would perform hundreds more baptisms and funerals and marriages. He would be remembered fondly by the families he served. And he would never speak of Josiah again, never acknowledge the choice he'd made over roasted duck and imported wine. Some sins are committed through action, others through a silence so complete it becomes complicity. December in Louisiana didn't bring snow or the crisp cold of northern winters. Instead, it brought gray skies and a dampness that seeped into everything: clothing, timber, skin, hope. The cane fields stood harvested and stubbled, looking like the scalp of someone who'd been shorn bald. The grinding season was winding down, and the exhausted enslaved population moved through their final weeks of 18-hour days with the mechanical efficiency of people who'd learned to separate their bodies from their minds. Josiah continued working as if nothing had changed. He hauled the cane carts. He lifted the loads that would have required machinery elsewhere. He slept curled in his shed while the December damp worked its way into his joints. But beneath the performance of normalcy, he was moving with purpose. The first thing he did was accelerate his gathering. Every night after dark, he made trips into the swamp, following routes he'd memorized during daylight hours. He added to his cache more dried fish, more cornmeal, a flint striker he'd found near the cooperage, a tattered blanket someone had thrown away. He tested his rope, hanging from cypress branches to ensure it would hold not just his weight, but the weight of multiple people crossing water simultaneously. The second thing he did was begin recruiting in earnest. He couldn't tell people about the sale, news that explosive would spread beyond control, but he could speak in hypotheticals, in possibilities, in the language of coded suggestion that enslaved communities had developed for survival. To Thomas at the sugar mill, if something happened to the machinery, how long before it could be repaired? Thomas, understanding without needing elaboration. If someone broke the drive chain and scattered the parts, maybe 3 days, maybe 5 if they really knew what they were doing. To Sarah in the kitchen, if someone needed to get into the storage rooms at night, which doors could be opened without keys? Sarah, her hands never stopping their work. The root cellar has a window with a broken latch. The smokehouse door doesn't close all the way if you lift while you pull. To a field hand named Marcus. How many people would follow if someone led them into the swamp? Marcus, his voice barely above a whisper, depends on who was leading. Josiah counted. Not everyone would come. Some people were too old, too sick, too broken by years of bondage to believe escape was possible. Some had children too young to make the journey. Some simply couldn't overcome the fear that had been beaten into them bone deep since childhood. But he estimated that perhaps 25 people might be willing to risk everything for a chance at freedom. Ruth helped by talking to the women who worked in the weaving house, the kitchen, the main house. She asked careful questions, listened to careful answers, and slowly assembled a mental map of who could be trusted and who might turn informant to curry favor with the overseers. On December 14th, 6 days before the scheduled sale, Josiah made his decision. They would go on the night of December 19th. The moon would be new, providing maximum darkness. The grinding season would be officially finished, meaning the sugar mill would be shut down and less tightly guarded. Most importantly, it would be the night before Hendricks arrived to claim his purchase, giving them maximum time to put distance between themselves and pursuit. He told Thomas first, then Sarah, then Marcus. Each of them told 2 others, and those 2 told 2 more, until 23 people knew that something was happening on the 19th, though most didn't know exactly what. The uncertainty was intentional. What people didn't know, they couldn't reveal under interrogation. On December 17th, Virgil Cass noticed something was off. The overseer couldn't have identified exactly what had changed, but he'd spent enough years managing enslaved populations to develop an instinct for trouble. People were too quiet, too focused on their work, avoiding eye contact even more than usual. The normal background noise of conversation and complaint had diminished to near silence. Cass mentioned it to Bellefontaine that evening. Something's brewing. Can't say what, but I can feel it. Bellefontaine, distracted by preparations for a dinner party he was hosting the following week, waved the concern away. It's December. Everyone's tired. Give them Christmas off. This year, that'll settle things. If you say so, Cass said. But he increased patrols around the quarters that night, and he made sure his pistol was loaded. 2 days remained. On the afternoon of December 18th, Josiah was sent to repair a section of fencing near the northern edge of the plantation property. The task required him to haul heavy cypress posts nearly a quarter mile from the timber yard to the fence line, work that would have taken 3 men most of a day. Josiah did it in 4 hours, working with methodical efficiency while the winter sun traced its shallow arc across the gray sky. What the overseer who assigned the task didn't know was that the fence line ran within 300 yards of the swamp access point Josiah had been preparing for months. While loading the posts onto his cart, Josiah had also loaded a canvas sack containing the last of his gathered supplies. Dried fish, a whetstone, strips of cloth that could be used as bandages, and a small tin of black powder he'd stolen from the main house 2 weeks earlier when Sarah had left the supply room briefly unlocked. He cached the sack in the hollow cypress, alongside the rope and food he'd already hidden. Then he returned to the plantation, pulled his cart back to the timber yard, and went about his evening duties as if nothing unusual had happened. That night, he met with the core group, who would lead different sections of the escape. Thomas would disable the sugar mill to create confusion and delay pursuit. Sarah would gather anyone sheltering in the main house quarters and lead them to the first rendezvous point. Marcus would be responsible for releasing the plantation's horses from their paddock and driving them south, away from the actual escape route, to send pursuers in the wrong direction. Ruth would stay with Josiah, helping coordinate the movement of people who needed assistance. The elderly, the injured, those whose fear made them hesitate. They met in the cooper's shed after midnight, 7 people hunched in darkness that smelled of wood shavings and dried oak. Josiah spoke in a whisper that somehow carried perfect authority. Tomorrow night, after the bell rings for sleep, you wait 1 hour. Then you move. Sarah takes her group north through the main yard. Marcus goes to the paddock. Thomas goes to the mill. Everyone else waits at the big oak by the south field. When you hear the mill machinery break, you start moving toward the swamp. Follow the white rags I tied to trees this afternoon. You'll be able to see them even in the dark if you know to look. Once you reach the cypress grove, you wait. I'll come last with Ruth and anyone who's slow. We cross the first channel together, then we split into 3 groups to make tracking harder. Questions? What if they catch us before we reach the swamp? Someone asked. They won't. The confusion at the mill will pull attention there. By the time they realize what's happening, we'll be deep enough into the swamp that they won't follow in the dark. What if they do follow? Josiah was quiet for a long moment. Then, I'll handle it. The certainty in those 3 words needed no elaboration. Everyone in that shed knew what Josiah could do with his hands, knew the strength that allowed him to pull loads that should have been impossible. The implication was clear. Anyone who followed them into the swamp would not be returning. They dispersed separately, filtering back to their cabins at intervals to avoid suspicion. Josiah walked to his shed and lay down on the rough boards that served as his bed. He didn't sleep. Instead, he stared at the darkness above him and thought about the ways this could fail, the ways people could die, the weight of responsibility that came with leading others toward freedom or death. 23 people. 23 lives depending on decisions he'd make in the next 24 hours. At dawn on December 19th, Josiah rose and went to work as usual. He hauled cane residue from the mill to the compost heaps. He repaired a broken cart axle. He moved through the day with the same steady competence he always showed, drawing no attention, creating no suspicion. But inside his chest, his heart was counting down the hours. That evening, Claude Bellefontaine hosted a small dinner for 3 neighboring plantation owners and their wives. The purpose was partly social. The sugar season's end was traditionally celebrated with gatherings among the parish's wealthier families, and partly practical. Bellefontaine wanted witnesses to his good fortune, people who would see Hendrix arrive tomorrow and take possession of the Louisiana giant, people who would spread the story and cement Bellefontaine's reputation as a man who'd turned a curiosity into a windfall. The meal was served by Hannah and 2 other enslaved women who'd been trained to move silently through the dining room, refilling glasses and clearing plates, while rendering themselves invisible to the white people whose conversation flowed around them like water around stones. The main course was venison shot on Bellefontaine's property, served with rice pilaf and collard greens cooked with pork fat. The wine was French, the silverware was imported, and the conversation was the usual mixture of politics, gossip, and complaints about labor costs. "It's a shame you're selling the giant," one of the guests said, a man named Desmarais who owned a plantation 5 miles upriver. "I'd been hoping to borrow him for some levee work next spring." "Business is business," Bellefontaine replied, cutting into his venison with satisfaction. "And Hendrix made an offer I couldn't refuse. Still, it seems wasteful. A man that's strong could be breeding stock. Think of the laborers you could produce. I considered it, but the museum money is guaranteed. Breeding is speculation. The women at the table shifted uncomfortably, steering the conversation towards safer topics: the upcoming social season in New Orleans, plans for Mardi Gras, the quality of this year's sugar crop. The enslaved women serving the meal heard every word, filed every comment away, and said nothing. Hannah, refilling wine glasses with hands that had learned not to shake no matter what was said in her presence, thought about Josiah sleeping in his shed. She thought about the whispers that had moved through the quarters all day, the sense that something was building like a storm just beyond the horizon. She'd been invited to join the escape, but had declined. She had an elderly mother in one of the cabins and a son who was only 3 years old. Running meant leaving them or risking their deaths in the swamp, so she'd chosen to stay, to serve wine to men discussing human breeding, while her heart broke quietly in her chest. But she also made a choice that night, a small act of rebellion that would matter more than she could know. At 11 o'clock, when the dinner guests had finally departed and the Bellefontaine family had retired upstairs, Hannah was cleaning the dining room when she noticed that Claude Bellefontaine had left his pipe and tobacco pouch on the sideboard. She picked them up, intending to deliver them to his bedroom as she'd been trained to do. But as she climbed the stairs, she passed the door to his study and noticed it was slightly ajar, lamplight spilling through the gap. She shouldn't have looked. Looking was dangerous, but she looked anyway. Inside the study, spread across Bellefontaine's desk, were papers related to the sale of Josiah, the contract with Hendricks, a letter from the Philadelphia Museum describing the exhibition plans, and most damning, a map showing the route Hendricks planned to take from Bellefontaine to the river port, where a steamboat would be waiting to carry Josiah north. Hannah stared at those papers for perhaps 10 seconds. Then she memorized what she could, left the pipe and tobacco outside Bellefontaine's bedroom door, and descended the stairs to finish her work. An hour later, she was back in her own cabin, whispering what she'd seen to her cabin mate, a woman named Esther who was one of the 23 planning to escape. They're taking him by river. The boat dock is 3 miles south. If something goes wrong tomorrow, if they catch people heading for the swamp, they might send riders to the dock to cut off escape. Esther absorbed this information silently. Then, I'll tell the others. Knowledge as weapon. Meanwhile, in his shed, Josiah lay awake and listened to the plantation settle into night. Dogs barking in the distance, the creak of settling timbers, the wind moving through the bare cane fields with a sound like whispered warnings. In 6 hours, he would either be leading 23 people to freedom, or he would be leading them to their deaths. He thought about Ruth, asleep in her cabin with her back still healing from Cass's whip. He thought about Thomas, who'd lost his fingers to machinery and would lose his life if they were caught. He thought about all the people who'd placed their trust in him simply because he was tall, strong, and willing to try. The weight of it should have been crushing. Instead, it felt clarifying. This was the moment his entire life had been building toward. Everything else, the hauling, the exhibiting, the sleeping curled like a child, had been preparation for this. At 4 a.m, with 2 hours until dawn, Josiah rose from his bed. He stretched to his full height, his head nearly touching the shed's low ceiling. He rolled his shoulders, tested his muscles, confirmed that his body was ready for what was coming. Then he knelt in the darkness and whispered a prayer his mother had taught him before she died. Lord, if you're listening, make me strong enough, and if I fail, make it quick. The plantation bell rang for morning work at 6 o'clock on December 19th, 1827. The sound carried across the quarters, sharp and insistent, a reminder that even on the day before a man would be sold to a traveling exhibition, the sugar harvest's final tasks still demanded completion. Josiah responded as he always did, rising from his shed and reporting to the workyard for assignment. Virgil Cass was waiting with his usual clipboard and usual scowl. "You're on cart duty today. There's crushed cane in the mill that needs hauling to the compost." He squinted at Josiah. "Tomorrow, you're someone else's problem, but today you work." "Yes, sir," Josiah said. He spent the morning pulling his cart between the sugar mill and the compost heaps, loads that would normally require a mule, but which Bellefontaine had decided Josiah should handle as a demonstration to any visiting planters who might happen by. The work was monotonous, which suited Josiah perfectly. Monotony meant no scrutiny. He could move through the day on autopilot while his mind tracked the position of overseers, the location of weapons, the timing of patrols. At noon, he saw Samuel Hendricks arrive early, a full day ahead of schedule. The cotton merchant stepped down from his carriage looking pleased with himself, clearly eager to claim his purchase and begin the journey north. Bellefontaine greeted him with handshakes and backslapping, ushering him into the main house for lunch, while Josiah watched from the mill yard, his massive hands tightening on the cart traces. Early arrival complicated everything. If Hendricks was here, sleeping in the main house, he might wake during the escape. He might raise alarms. He might... Josiah forced himself to breathe slowly. Plans adapted. That's what made them plans rather than wishes. At 3 in the afternoon, Thomas made his way to the sugar mill and began his assigned work checking the machinery for maintenance needs before the equipment was put into storage for the off-season. What he was actually doing was loosening critical bolts, filing through support chains until they were hanging by threads, and creating mechanical failures that would appear accidental but would disable the mill for days. At 5 o'clock, the work bell rang for evening. The enslaved population dispersed to their cabins for the brief hour before supper would be distributed. Josiah went to his shed. Ruth brought him cornbread and a piece of salt pork, food he ate without tasting while she sat beside him. "You ready?" he asked. "I'm terrified," she said, "but I'm ready. We're not going to die out there." "You don't know that. I know I'll tear apart anyone who tries to stop us." Ruth looked at her brother, this giant who'd taken her whipping, and nodded. "I know you will." At 8 o'clock, the plantation settled into its nightly routine. Lamps were extinguished in the cabins. The overseer's patrol made its rounds. The main house went dark except for 2 windows, Hendricks's guest room and Bellefontaine's study, where the master was presumably reviewing paperwork related to tomorrow's transaction. At 9 o'clock, Josiah left his shed. He moved through the darkness with surprising stealth for a man his size, his bare feet making almost no sound on the packed earth. His first stop was the cooper's shed, where he'd hidden the tools he'd need. A heavy iron pry bar and a length of chain he'd been slowly sawing through for the past week. The chain was meant to look like it had failed naturally, corroded by moisture and stress. When wrapped around the sugar mill's main drive shaft and given one good pull, it would snap and send the machinery into catastrophic failure. Thomas was already at the mill when Josiah arrived, working by feel in the darkness. "I've loosened everything I can safely loosen," Thomas whispered, "but you'll need to provide the final break. Make it loud." "How loud?" "Loud enough to wake every overseer on the property." Josiah nodded. Loud was good. Loud meant confusion. Confusion meant opportunity. At 9:45, Josiah wrapped his sabotaged chain around the mill's main drive shaft. He braced his feet, gripped the chain with both hands, and pulled. The sound of metal shrieking and machinery destroying itself echoed across the plantation like the cry of something dying. The drive chain snapped. The shaft twisted. Gears that had been barely hanging on let go entirely, and the entire mechanical assembly collapsed inward with a crash that could be heard a mile away. Josiah and Thomas were running before the echoes faded. The confusion was immediate and total. Lamps blazed to life in the overseer's cottage. Virgil Cass burst from his door, still pulling on his trousers, shouting for his assistant overseers to get to the mill. In the main house, Claude Bellefontaine stumbled down the stairs, while Samuel Hendricks, woken from sleep, stood in his doorway looking bewildered. No one was looking at the quarters. That's where Sarah moved through the darkness, tapping on cabin doors with a prearranged signal. People emerged carrying nothing but the clothes, on their backs. Taking anything else would signal intent and waste precious seconds. They moved toward the rendezvous point at the big oak, a gnarled live oak that stood like a sentinel at the edge of the south field. Marcus went to the horse paddock, moving fast, and opened the gates. He didn't try to mount any of the horses. He simply spooked them, sending them galloping south in a thunder of hooves that drew more shouts and more confusion. 23 people gathered beneath the oak. They ranged in age from 14 to 60, in physical condition from strong to barely mobile. Ruth did a quick count, confirming everyone who'd committed to the escape was present. Then they waited, watching the pandemonium at the mill, watching overseers run in multiple directions, trying to understand what was happening. Josiah appeared like a mountain materializing from fog. "Move! Now! Follow the white rags. Don't run. Running makes noise. Walk fast and stay together." They began moving north toward the swamp access point Josiah had prepared. The white rags he'd tied to trees were barely visible in the darkness, but just visible enough if you knew to look for them. The group moved in a column. Older people in the middle, stronger people at front and back. Behind them, Virgil Cass finally realized what should have been obvious from the start. The mill destruction was a distraction. He turned toward the quarters, saw the cabins were too quiet, threw open doors to find them empty. His shout cut through the night. "They're running! Half the workers are gone! Get the dogs!" But the dogs were in a kennel near the horse paddock, and the horses were scattered across 2 miles of fields. By the time Cass got the animals organized for pursuit, the escapees had reached the swamp's edge. Josiah was the last to enter the tree line. He turned back toward the plantation, toward the lights and the shouting and the life he'd known for 18 years, and felt nothing but relief. Then he followed his sister into the darkness. The cypress swamp closed around them like a fist. The temperature dropped 10 degrees as soon as they passed the first line of trees, the canopy blocking what little moonlight might have penetrated. Water appeared beneath their feet, cold and ankle-deep, making every step a negotiation between solid ground and sucking mud. The smell was overwhelming, rot and life and the thick vegetal musk of a place where water and land never quite decided which would dominate. "Stay close," Josiah called softly. "If you lose sight of the person in front of you, stop and call out. We don't leave anyone behind." They'd walked for perhaps 20 minutes when they heard the first sounds of pursuit. Dogs baying in the distance, still far away, but closing. Josiah had anticipated this. He led the group to a wide, slow-moving channel he'd scouted previously. "Everyone into the water. Wade across. The dogs can't track across water." The channel was waist-deep at its center, the current gentle but steady. People helped each other across, the strong supporting the weak, everyone understanding that this was the first real test. If someone panicked, if someone went under, precious time would be lost. But they made it. All 23 reached the far bank and kept moving. Josiah stayed in the water, moving upstream to where he'd cached his rope. He strung it across the channel between two cypress trees, creating a barrier that would be invisible in the darkness to anyone following. Then he rejoined the group. They walked for 3 more hours, moving deeper into the swamp where Josiah's pre-scouting became critical. He led them along ridges of higher ground, avoided sinkholes disguised by leaves, steered them around areas where alligators nested. Once, they heard something massive moving through the water nearby, and everyone froze until the sound faded. At 1 in the morning, they reached the hollow cypress where Josiah had cached his supplies. He distributed the dried fish and cornmeal in equal portions, along with the strips of cloth for anyone whose feet were bleeding from the rough walking. They rested for 15 minutes, speaking in whispers. "How far have we come?" someone asked. "Maybe 4 miles, Josiah said. "That's all? 4 miles into the swamp is worth 20 on open ground. They won't follow us this deep at night." "What happens in the morning?" "We split into 3 groups and head different directions. That way, if they track one group, the others still get away." A woman named Esther, the one Hannah had told about the river dock, spoke up. "If they're smart, they'll send riders to the dock south of here. That's where boats leave for upriver. We need to avoid that route." Josiah nodded. "We're going northwest, toward the free settlements past Lake Maurepas. It's further, but there are people there who'll help." They rested another 15 minutes, then continued. Behind them, somewhere in the darkness, the pursuit had stalled. Virgil Cass and his men had reached the channel where Josiah's rope was strung and had stopped, unwilling to cross in the darkness with dogs that were already confused by the water crossing. They'd made camp, lit fires, and were waiting for dawn. That delay was everything. By sunrise on December 20th, the 23 escapees had put nearly 8 miles between themselves and Bellefontaine Plantation. The vice was broken. Dawn on December 20th came gray and cold, the kind of winter morning where the boundary between water and air seemed to dissolve into a general dampness that penetrated everything. The pursuit party, led by Virgil Cass, and now including Claude Bellefontaine himself, resumed tracking at first light. They'd crossed Josiah's rope barrier in the darkness after one of the dogs had gotten tangled in it. Cass had cursed the obstacle, assuming it was natural debris, and now they were trying to pick up the trail on the far side of the channel. Samuel, Hendricks had insisted on joining the pursuit, though he'd proven worse than useless, stumbling over roots and complaining about his ruined suit. Bellefontaine had tried to convince him to return to the plantation, but Hendricks was adamant. "That giant is my property now. I've paid $3,000. I want him recovered." "You paid $3,000 for a bill of sale," Bellefontaine snapped. The man himself seems to have other plans. The pursuit party numbered 11 men total. Cass, Bellefontaine, Hendricks, 2 assistant overseers, and 6 hired trackers from neighboring plantations who'd been promised reward money for any captured runaways. They had 3 dogs and enough firearms to start a small war. They should have been more than sufficient to recapture a group of 23 people, half of whom were exhausted before they even started running. But they weren't pursuing through open country. They were pursuing through terrain that had swallowed entire expeditions, where the difference between solid ground and bottomless mud wasn't visible until you were already sinking, where every cypress knee could trip you and every hanging moss could hide a water moccasin. And they were pursuing someone who'd been mapping this place for years. By mid-morning, the pursuit party was lost. The dogs had lost the scent at another water crossing. The trackers were arguing about which direction the escapees had gone. Hendrix was sitting on a log, looking miserable and out of place in his ruined city clothes. Bellefontaine was beginning to understand that the money he'd spent showing off Josiah to visitors would have been better spent on adequate supervision. Cass made the decision. We split up, half go north, half go west. We cover more ground that way. It was exactly the wrong decision, but it was the decision Josiah had anticipated. A divided force was a weakened force. The group going west stumbled into one of the traps Josiah had prepared, a stretch of solid-looking ground that was actually floating vegetation over deep water. Two men went through to their hips before being pulled out, and the dogs refused to go further. That group turned back, demoralized and soaked. The group going north, which included Bellefontaine and Hendrix, made better progress. They followed what seemed like clear signs, bent branches, footprints in mud, until they reached a clearing where the trees opened up and revealed the Mississippi River in the distance, brown and swollen with winter rain. And there, at a small inlet where boats were sometimes moored, they found their boats. All three had been smashed. Holes punched through the hulls, oars snapped and thrown into the river. The ropes that should have secured them cut cleanly, as if by someone with enormous strength and sufficient anger to take the time to ensure thorough destruction. Bellefontaine stared at the wreckage with mounting fury. He did this. The giant. He came here and destroyed our only river access. When? Hendrix demanded. He was running with the others. He must have split off, come here while we were stumbling around in the dark. He knew we'd head for the river eventually. A tracker knelt by the boats, examining the damage. These holes weren't chopped or cut. They were punched through, like someone just drove their fist through the wood. Everyone went quiet, considering the implication. A man strong enough to punch through boat hulls was a man who could do the same to human skulls. The pursuit suddenly felt less like hunting and more like walking into a trap. Cass tried to rally them. We can still track them. We don't need boats. We just need to keep moving. But the enthusiasm had drained from the group like water through broken planks. They'd been out since before dawn. They were wet, cold, lost, and facing an opponent who'd proven far more prepared than anyone had anticipated. One of the hired trackers spoke what several were thinking. That giant knows these swamps. We don't. We keep going. We might not come back. There's a reward, Cass reminded them. There's also alligators and sinkholes, and a man who can apparently tear apart boats with his bare hands. I signed up to track runaways, not to die in a swamp. 2 of the trackers left, then a third. By noon, the pursuit party had been reduced to 5. Cass, Bellefontaine, Hendrix, and 2 assistant overseers who were loyal more out of fear of unemployment than conviction. They made one last attempt, pushing northwest based on a guess about where the escapees might be heading. But without dogs, the animals had given up after the 3rd water crossing, and without experienced trackers, they were just 5 men wandering through hostile terrain with diminishing hope. At 3 in the afternoon, they admitted defeat and began the long walk back to Bellefontaine Plantation. Elsewhere, nearly 15 miles away, Josiah stood waist-deep in a bayou channel, holding a rope he'd strung across the water. One by one, the 23 people he'd led into the swamp were using that rope to cross safely, the current strong enough to sweep them away without the anchor his strength provided. Ruth crossed last, and when she reached the far bank, she turned to watch her brother. He was silhouetted against the gray water, chains that had been meant to restrain him now repurposed as markers he'd tied to trees to mark the safe route. He looked like something from legend, a giant standing in the mist, guiding his people toward freedom. "You're staring," Josiah said. "I'm remembering," Ruth replied, "for when we tell this story later. If they survived long enough for there to be a later." December 20th became December 21st, and still the 23 moved through wetlands that seemed designed to discourage human passage. They'd split into 3 groups as planned, each taking different routes, but all heading generally northwest toward the free settlements beyond, Lake Maurepas. Josiah's group consisted of 8 people, including Ruth and Thomas. The other 2 groups were led by Marcus and Sarah, people Josiah trusted to make smart decisions when pursuit came. Because pursuit would come. Bellefontaine had too much pride and too much money invested to let this insult stand. He'd bring more men, better trackers, and probably patrollers from neighboring parishes who specialized in recapturing runaways. The mathematics of power hadn't changed. White planters still controlled the courts, the militias, the legal machinery that classified human beings as property. What had changed was that 23 people had decided that freedom was worth risking death. On the morning of December 21st, Josiah's group reached the edge of the swamp, where it transitioned to higher ground. They'd been walking for nearly 40 hours with minimal rest, and exhaustion was beginning to take a toll. 2 people had developed fevers. One woman had cut her foot badly on a submerged branch. Josiah himself had been awake for 3 days straight, his massive frame running on willpower and the dried fish he'd rationed carefully. "We need to rest," Ruth said quietly. "People can't keep going like this." Josiah knew she was right. He also knew that rest meant vulnerability. But there was a decision point here, a place where pushing beyond human limits would result in people collapsing mid-flight and being left behind. He made the call. "We rest for 6 hours, then we move again." They found a grove of oak trees on slightly higher ground, built a tiny fire that they surrounded with green wood to minimize smoke, and collapsed into sleep. Josiah took first watch, his back against an oak trunk, scanning the approaches to their camp with eyes that had learned to function without adequate rest. During his watch, he thought about what came next. Even if they reached the free settlements, safety wasn't guaranteed. Slave catchers operated in those areas, sometimes kidnapping free black people and selling them south. The Fugitive Slave Act meant that legally, every person in his group could be recaptured and returned to bondage at any moment, in any state. But there were communities that protected runaways, churches that hid people, networks that moved escapees further north, into territories where enslavement was prohibited and enforcement was less vigorous. If they could reach those networks, if they could make it to the free settlements without being caught, they had a chance. 6 hours later, they resumed walking. The landscape was changing. Less water, more solid ground, pine forests replacing cypress swamps. It was easier terrain, but also more dangerous because it was easier for pursuers to move through as well. On December 22nd, they encountered the first proof that other groups had been caught. They found abandoned supplies, a bundle of the dried fish Josiah had distributed, dropped and left behind. Either someone had been running too fast to carry it, or they'd been captured, and it had been discarded by their captors. Josiah's group fell silent. The unspoken question hung in the cold air. Which group had been caught? Sarah's? Marcus's? How many people were already dead or chained? They kept moving. On December 23rd, 3 days after the escape began, Josiah's group reached a river crossing where locals had built a crude ferry, 2 flatboats connected by rope, allowing farmers to move between parishes without the expense of a proper bridge. The ferry was unmanned, but it was there, and it represented the boundary between the hunting ground and relative safety. Josiah went first, crossing alone to check the far bank. When he confirmed it was clear, he signaled for the others to follow. They crossed in 2 groups, the makeshift ferry creaking under their weight, but holding. When the last person stepped onto the far bank, Josiah cut the rope connecting the flatboats, sending them drifting downstream. Another bridge burned, another barrier between them and pursuit. That night, they saw lights in the distance. A settlement. Buildings that weren't part of a plantation. The promise of warmth and food and people who might help rather than hunt. Ruth stood beside her brother, looking at those distant lights. "Do you think we made it?" "We're not dead yet," Josiah said. "That's something." They approached the settlement carefully, sending Thomas ahead as a scout since his smaller frame was less likely to cause alarm. He returned an hour later with news. The settlement was called Saint-Amant, and it had a community of free people of color who ran a small church and a general store. There were white people too, but this wasn't plantation country. People minded their own business. And most importantly, a woman at the church said she knew people who could help travelers heading north. Saint-Amant, Louisiana, in December of 1827, was a settlement of perhaps 200 people scattered along the east bank of the Amite River. It existed in the margins between the plantation economy and the free territories further north. Too small to sustain large-scale agriculture, too practical to care much about other people's business, and strategically willing to look the other way when certain travelers passed through in the night. The woman at the church was named Celeste Broussard, a free woman of color in her 50s who'd bought her freedom 30 years earlier and had been helping runaways ever since. She took one look at Josiah, this giant standing in her doorway with 7 exhausted people behind him, and her face split into a smile. "Lord have mercy," she said. "I heard they had a giant down at Bellefontaine, but I thought it was just talk." "It's not talk," Josiah said quietly. Celeste brought them into the church basement, a low-ceilinged room that Josiah had to duck to enter, and she fed them the first hot meal they'd had in 4 days. Rice with beans, and salt pork, cornbread, chicory coffee sweetened with molasses. While they ate, she asked questions. "How many of you escaped total?" 23. We split into 3 groups." "Where are the others?" "I don't know. We were supposed to meet up at a marker point 5 miles north of here, but I don't know if they made it." Celeste nodded slowly. "There's been talk in the parish. Bellefontaine's offering $200 reward for you personally, 50 per head for the others. He's got patrollers out searching every settlement between here and Baton Rouge." $200 was enough to make even sympathetic people reconsider their principles. Josiah saw Ruth's face tighten with fear. "We can move on," Josiah said. "We won't bring trouble here." "You'll move when you're strong enough to move," Celeste said firmly. "Right now, you're all half dead from exhaustion. You rest here for 2 days. I'll put out word for the other groups to find us if they can. Then we get you connected with people who can move you further north." Over the next 48 hours, the church basement became a temporary refuge. People slept for 12, 14, 16 hours straight. Celeste brought food and tended to injuries, cleaning wounds, providing salve for blistered feet, forcing broth down the throats of the 2 people who'd developed fevers. Slowly, strength returned. On Christmas Eve, Marcus's group arrived. 7 people, exhausted but intact. They'd taken a more direct northern route and had nearly been caught twice, evading pursuit by hiding in a tobacco barn and then wading through a creek for 2 miles to lose the dogs. Their reunion with Josiah's group was emotional. Tears, embraces, confirmation that at least 16 of the original 23 were accounted for. Sarah's group never came. On December 26th, a free black man named Augustus, who worked as a teamster, brought news. He'd heard from a contact in Ascension Parish that 7 runaways had been captured on December 21st. 3 men and 4 women, caught while trying to cross a plantation's northern boundary. They'd been returned to Bellefontaine, where they were being held pending a public example. Josiah felt the news like a blow to the chest. 7 people. Sarah among them, almost certainly. Caught and returned, facing punishments that would be designed to ensure no one else was inspired to run. What kind of example? Ruth asked quietly. Augustus looked uncomfortable. The kind that involves public whipping, branding, and sale to buyers out of state. Bellefontaine wants everyone to know what happens when you run. The room went silent. 16 people had made it. 7 had been caught. The mathematics of freedom were written in human cost. Josiah stood abruptly, his head brushing the ceiling beams. "I'm going back." "You can't," Celeste said immediately. "Going back means dying. It means getting everyone here caught. I can't leave them." "You already did. The moment you crossed that ferry, you left them. That was the price of getting these 16 people out. You can't save everyone." Josiah knew she was right. The rational part of his mind understood the mathematics. But the part of him that had taken Ruth's whipping, that had carried her to their cabin while her blood soaked his hands, couldn't accept leaving Sarah and the others to be brutalized as punishment for his escape. Ruth grabbed his arm. "Josiah, listen to me. If you go back, you die. And then everything we did, everyone who got out, it means nothing. You want to honor them? You survive. You make it north. You tell the story so people know what happened here." The argument lasted an hour. In the end, pragmatism won. Josiah couldn't save Sarah's group without sacrificing the 16 who'd made it. The cost was too high. The mathematics were inescapable. But he made a promise to himself that night, standing in the church basement while the others slept. Sarah and the others would be remembered. Their names would be spoken. The story of Bellefontaine Plantation and the escape of 1827 would be told in full, including the cost. On December 27th, Celeste made arrangements. The 16 survivors would be split into 4 groups of 4, moving north at intervals over the next 2 weeks. Each group would have a different route, different guides, different safe houses. The risk was spread. The chances of everyone making it were higher if they weren't traveling as one conspicuous mass. Josiah's group left on December 28th. Celeste had found a farmer willing to transport them, hidden in a wagon filled with cotton bales. A dangerous irony that wasn't lost on anyone. They would travel to a free settlement near the Arkansas border, where other connections would move them further north, toward territories where enslavement was prohibited by law, if not always by practice. Before they left, Celeste pulled Josiah aside. "People are going to talk about you. The giant who led the escape from Bellefontaine, the man who smashed boats and strung ropes across bayous and stood waist-deep in channels holding people steady while they crossed. You're going to become a story." "I'm not a story. I'm just tall." "You're more than tall, and you know it. You're proof that the impossible isn't, You remember that. And you tell people what happened here. The truth. All of it. The ones who made it and the ones who didn't. Josiah nodded. Then he climbed into the wagon, ducking his head to fit beneath the cotton bales, and began the next phase of a journey that would take him 3 more years to complete. The public punishment of Sarah's group took place on January 3, 1828, in the yard at Bellefontaine Plantation. Claude Bellefontaine had invited witnesses from neighboring parishes, turning the brutality into a spectacle designed to discourage future escapes. 7 people were whipped until they could barely stand. Then they were branded on the cheek with the letter R for runaway. Then they were sold to a trader heading to the cotton plantations of Mississippi, where life expectancy for field laborers was measured in years rather than decades. Sarah died of infection from the branding within 2 weeks. The others disappeared into the machinery of enslavement, their names lost to history except in the coded records of sales and transfers. But the escape wasn't forgotten. Stories spread through the enslaved communities along the Mississippi River, growing with each retelling. The giant who'd pulled cane carts became the giant who'd torn down gates with his bare hands. The man who'd strung rope across channels became the man who'd walked across water. The careful preparation and strategic planning became miraculous intervention, divine assistance, proof that resistance was possible even against impossible odds. White planters tried to suppress the stories, but you can't suppress hope once it's taken root. Bellefontaine Plantation saw 4 more escape attempts in 1828, none successful, but all inspired by Josiah's example. Other plantations in St. James Parish experienced similar upticks in resistance. Work slowdowns, accidents that destroyed equipment, fires of mysterious origin. Virgil Cass lost his position as overseer after the escape. He'd been responsible for security, and 16 people escaping on his watch was unforgivable. He found work at a smaller plantation in Iberville Parish and drank himself to death by 1832. Claude Bellefontaine never recovered financially from the loss. Between the escaped workers, the damaged sugar mill, and the $3,000 he had to refund to Samuel Hendricks for failure to deliver the purchased property, the plantation's profit margin collapsed. He sold Bellefontaine in 1830 and moved to New Orleans, where he died in obscurity a decade later. Samuel Hendricks returned to Philadelphia empty-handed and sued Bellefontaine for breach of contract. The case dragged through courts for 5 years before being dismissed. He never attempted to purchase another curiosity for exhibition. As for Josiah himself, his trail becomes harder to follow after he left Saint-Amant. There are fragmentary records, a bill of sale for passage on a riverboat to Cairo, Illinois, dated February 1828, listing a tall Negro man among the passengers. An oral history collected in the 1930s from a woman in Indiana, whose grandmother claimed to have sheltered a giant in her barn during the 1820s. A newspaper mention from Detroit in 1830 describing an unusually tall black man working on the docks. The most credible account comes from a Quaker abolitionist named Benjamin Lundy, who kept detailed records of the people he helped move along the Underground Railroad. In his journal from April 1831, Lundy describes meeting a man of extraordinary height, at least 8 feet, who'd escaped bondage in Louisiana and made his way through 5 states to reach Canada. He was quiet, thoughtful, and carried with him a profound grief for those he'd left behind. When asked what he intended to do with his freedom, he said he would work to earn money to purchase the freedom of others, particularly those who'd been recaptured after his escape. I told him such redemptions were nearly impossible. He replied that impossible only meant no one had succeeded yet. There's no definitive record of what happened to Josiah after crossing into Canada. He disappears from the documented history, becoming instead a figure of folklore, the Louisiana giant who led his people through the swamps, who stood in the river mist guiding others to freedom, who proved that size and strength could be weapons against a system designed to crush both. But sometimes, in the oral histories of families descended from those who escaped Bellefontaine, you'll find a detail that rings too specific to be pure invention. A mention of rope woven from Spanish moss, a description of someone standing waist-deep in water, holding steady while others crossed. A name whispered with reverence. Josiah, who showed us the way out. Ruth made it to Canada. She's listed in the 1831 census of Ontario as Ruth Freeman, seamstress, living in a community of formerly enslaved people who'd built a new settlement in the wilderness. She married, had children, and lived to the age of 73. In interviews late in her life, she would tell stories about her brother, careful not to reveal too much, careful to protect people still living in bondage, but always ending with the same line. He was the gentlest person I ever knew, and the strongest. Not just in body, in everything that matters. Thomas, the man who'd lost his fingers to the sugar mill, made it as far as Ohio before being recaptured in 1829. He was sold to a plantation in Alabama and died there in 1836. His death certificate lists the cause as general debility, the catch-all term used when enslaved people simply gave up. 16 people made it to freedom. 7 were caught and sold away. The mathematics of the Bellefontaine escape remained brutal, a 2-to-1 ratio of liberation to recapture. But in a system designed to make escape impossible, 2-to-1 was a miracle. The shed where Josiah slept still stood on what had been Bellefontaine plantation land until Hurricane Betsy tore through Louisiana in 1965 and finally knocked it down. Local historians who'd been documenting the old sugar plantations took photographs before the demolition. The doorframe had been rebuilt 6 times over the years, each iteration slightly taller than the last, as if the structure itself was trying to accommodate a ghost. In the 1980s, archaeologists surveying the site found iron rings welded to what had been the frame of a cane cart, the harness they'd made for Josiah. The metal had rusted nearly through, but the rings were intact, hanging on by threads of corroded iron, too stubborn to let go entirely. And sometimes, on December nights when mist rises from the bayous and the cypress trees stand like sentinels in the darkness, locals swear they can see a tall figure moving through the water, chains around his neck transformed into tools of liberation, leading a line of shadows towards something the living can't quite see, but the dead remember perfectly. The story persists because it has to. Because 23 people decided that freedom was worth risking everything. Because 16 of them made it. Because 7 of them didn't, and someone has to remember. Subscribe if you want the next deep dive.